Now, anyone who has looked for a Claude Debussy playlist on Spotify or iTunes or has like rummaged through a bin of CDs or vinyl at a music store will notice that at least half of the album covers feature the works of Monet, be it a lush landscape, a misty like cityscape, like his scenes of London, or a seascape, basically like all the scapes. And one can see why, because a lot of these works are contemporaneous with Debussy's musical output. And more importantly, they're simply visually and commercially appealing. Like in short, like Monet sells. But as we explore the critical language around Monet's paintings, we will see that discussions of his mature like paintings often invoke musical language, like terminology or like nomenclature. And for those in the know, which soon will include like all of you, if not already, the choice of Monet on these covers reflects perhaps, a much deeper aesthetic connection, both ideological and formal, that tie the two Claudes together. So I'd like to begin with the most obvious question on everyone's mind, and that is, were Monet's paintings directly inspired by music? And my answer is probably not. And I hope you will stay with me and not leave the room, and I can explain why. Well, that is unlike a lot of Monet's other like colleagues and friends. What's interesting about his case is if you look through his like writings, like his correspondence, we don't find any accounts of his concert going habits or like references to a musical soiree that he might have attended. There's no mention of composers nor musical like reflections. But what we need to keep in mind is that although his paintings might not have been musically conceived, they were musically received. In fact, Monet's most experimental landscapes flourished, at the right time and at the right place, to like as one way of putting it. So to quote Louis Viardot, a writer who published an essay called Ut Pictoria Musica, which translates to as with music, so with painting, the 19th century was, an era for the meloman or the intense, music lover. Music was everywhere. And the sentiment was reiterated by the poet and critic like Charles Baudelaire, who wrote when looking at the works of Delacroix, whom he like venerated, that, it was only natural, like that the arts, like music, poetry, and like painting lent each other their reciprocal, like powers. And to paraphrase one of my former PhD supervisors, the grass was always greener, like on the other side. And so these arts strove to be like the other. So, what exactly was it about Monet's musical, like milieu, that would eventually foster a musical interpretation of his works? Let's take a look. So, first and foremost, concert life like flourished in France and in Paris specifically by mid-century, like public concerts were frequent, widely attended, and inexpensive, which democratized the musical experience. There was a massive building of new concert halls that were bigger and could accommodate larger orchestras and also better in terms of acoustics. So, for example, there was the 5,000 seat Cercle Napoleon that was built in 1852. At the same time, subscriptions also became very popular, and some of the most celebrated conductors of the time led series. And these included Charles Lamoureux, Pasdeloup and Edouard Collin, whose concerts took place at the Théâtre de Châtelet. So I have an image of the just mentioned Théâtre de Châtelet to the left, and Sargent has a lovely, like, sketch-like painting of the Pasdeloup concerts. Next, of course, there were also outdoor concerts in parks and gardens, and performances in cafes, salons, beer gardens, and music halls. And these other venues brought music into daily life. These postcards are really interesting. They show kiosk music, which literally translates to music kiosks or bandstands. And between 1850 to 1914, like 4,000 of these were built throughout France to fulfill the rising bourgeoisie need for divertissement. These bandstands were often rented by musical societies. Um, at the same time, we witness a new reading public, which emerged in the mid-century in Paris, and over 400 like cabinets de lecture or reading rooms were built. This also came with an unprecedented number of specialty press, such as the Revue Musicale or La Revue et Gazette Musicale de Paris. As musicologist Mark Pottinger emphasized, these specialty publications helped shape public taste and provided Monet's generation with a shared artistic lexicon and shared vocabulary, allowing readers to draw parallels between these different arts, specifically music and impressionist painting. In short, music criticism became a public, nationwide conversation. A lot of these conversations took place at brasseries and like cafes. So here we have Manet's print showing the Café Gerbois that was often frequented by Monet, Renoir, Sisley, the writers Astruc and Zola. In the latter half of the century, most upper middle class homes own a piano thanks to the mass production of pianos, which in turn fueled the demand for music lessons. And there were also innovations in lithography and mechanicized like typesetting, which made sheet music cheap and widely accessible. What I want us to like zero in on, focus on a little bit, is the painting by Renoir showing the two women at the piano. These are the daughters of Henri Leroux, who was an artist and art collector, and coincidentally, Debussy regarded Leroux as an elder brother. And I bring this up because Debussy would have this exposure to the visual arts, which would inform his own musical practice. To the left, we have a painting by Frederic Bazille, who was a close friend of Monet, but unfortunately, like died at the age of 28 during the Franco-Prussian War. And the two, as in Monet and Bazille, they would frequently travel to coastal towns in Normandy together to paint. But what I want you to notice is to the very right, we see a pianist friend, Edmond Maître, remember that name, at the piano. Now, Renoir and Monet are also in this studio painting. We're not quite sure which who is who, but what is for certain is that we see Manet in front of a canvas, and Bazille, who is extremely tall, is looking at, the master do his thing. But Monet is purportedly in there. And I bring this up because a lot of these figures would migrate from painting to painting. Returning to the cultural milieu, this leads to the growth of amateur music groups and fan clubs and choral societies. And speaking of fan clubs, the image to our left by Fontaine-Latour shows Le Petit Bayreuth, okay, which translates to Little Bayreuth, which was a Wagner fan club, and it was, I believe, started in 1876, which was the same year that Richard Wagner, the composer, launched his Ring cycle in Bayreuth, a small town in Germany. And the Festspielhaus, the name of his theater, held a lot of technical innovations, such as the invisible orchestra, which was essentially an orchestra um, below the stage, not visible to audiences. I just want to highlight the figures. Remember Edmond Matlin and how I talked about figures going from one painting to another? Where here he is listening to the composer Chabrier play Brahms on the piano. This is the studio of Batignolles, frequent clients, habitués at the Café Gerbois. We see Monet, Basile, whom we had met earlier, Renoir, and of course, Monet hiding, in the shadows. And finally, if we can go to the last group painting, I've specifically highlighted Eugène Delacroix, Whistler, Fontaine-Latour, and Charles Baudelaire, because the language they themselves employed to describe their musical experiences and like paintings would set the lexicon or foundation for how a lot of other critics would eventually describe Monet supposedly like musically suffused artworks. So I just want to point out to everyone that there is going to be a lot of text in this presentation because the literary, artistic, and musical worlds were so closely like intertwined. However, what I've done throughout this presentation is that I've only highlighted key words in the color. So these are the buzzwords that I'd like you to focus on. So please don't feel obliged to read everything. But if we can look to the upper left, here I've highlighted Baudelaire's, a stanza from Baudelaire's poem, Correspondences, from a collection of poems called Les Fleurs de Mal, the flowers of evil. And the line, the verse I want you to note is the following: perfumes, sounds, and colors correspond, because this intermingling of these sense perceptions like foreshadows, or it is synesthetic. And for those of you who are not familiar with synesthesia, it is, in a nutshell, the transposition of one sense modality in terms of another. For example, I might hear the color purple, but see G sharp. However, so not however, but I was going to point out that the German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, he wrote a collection of sketches and like essays called Christorania, like had inspired Baudelaire's exploration of synesthesia. But above all, it was the romantic master like Delacroix, whom we saw in the earlier painting, who would like fuel and like reinforce Baudelaire's fascination in the synesthetic the most. And we really see this not only in Baudelaire's poetics, but in his language of criticism. So, for example, if we look at the bottom left in Baudelaire's review, sorry, in the review of the Salon of 1848, he observes in Delacroix's use of color, harmony, melody, and counterpoint. And for those of you who are not familiar with counterpoint in music, it's a type of process where, and this is very simplistic, whereby like melodic threads, the same melodic thread, but in, let's say, like different keys are interwoven together. And one of the key traits about Delacroix's technique is that he uses, like in some of his paintings, like threads of color or brushstrokes that appear to be braided together. If you look to the right, and this really pertains to Impressionist art, one aspect that really enthralled Baudelaire about Fontaine's art is that it is only like from a distance, at least from looking at his mural paintings and larger paintings, in which his brushstrokes, which he compares to chords of color, the idea of combining notes and combining colors, come together to create these harmonies, and then harmonies, these passages of paint build up to melodies. And this is what made Delacroix's art so musical. The question is, were Delacroix's paintings actually musically motivated? And in this case, unlike Monet, my answer is yes. Delacroix was one of the foremost music lovers or melomans like of his generation. He was an extremely erudite thinker and a prolific author. And if you look through his journals, like his diaries, music was probably the next most talked about subject in his private, reflections, but also in many of his like publications. But we learn from his diaries that his most joyous like moments were like painting like in the dark in church while the choral mass, the sound of the choral mass like surrounded him. He like relished in listening to his close friend Chopin play impromptus on the piano. He was really keen to learn about the technicality of like counterpoint. And in this passage from one of his essays on the left, we have exactly an echoing, or rather a precursor of what Baudelaire had described. And that is the secret, to painting is to allow its elements to come together, as in it's not, there is an element of obscurity or vagueness or something that we cannot determine right away, much like music. And that is the magical chord. That is how we achieve the music of painting. And some of you might be wondering, well, what's so indeterminate about like music? Well, music intrinsically is non-mimetic. And what I mean by that is that it's abstract. It does not replicate what we see like visually, like the material world. And then the next slide, I mean, not the next slide, but the next quote, I thought I would, throw this in is George Sand. Like George Sand, the writer, as you may know, was in a relationship with Chopin. The three of them would have these wonderful musical like evenings. And here in George Sand's reminiscences of Delacroix, she recounts how Delacroix himself described how, les tons, as in the colors in painting, corresponded with les sons, or the sound of music. And what's really fascinating is how Delacroix interpreted how color, impacts the color adjacent to it is described by him as auditory reflections. So to quote the art historian Therese, like to paraphrase rather, the art historian Therese Dolan, while Delacroix represented Baudelaire's idea of the consummate painter musician, it was Richard Wagner who embodied the musician painter. And this would prompt Baudelaire to write what would be truly surprising would be to find that sound could not suggest color and that colors could not evoke the idea of a melody. And Baudelaire had written this in an essay called Wagner and Tannhauser in Paris. And what I want you to take note of also is that this painting, my apologies, I omitted the caption, is by Auguste Renoir, who did travel to Venice with Monet. And the year before, in 1882, Renoir had actually met Wagner to paint this portrait and had brought up impressionism to the composer. And so again, I mentioned like Delacroix's musicalized color as well as Wagner's visualized music because Baudelaire would develop a model of criticism that focused on the experiential. And of course, he would develop this vocabulary of vagueness, which is not more clear than in the works of Monet's friend, Fontaine-Latour. Fontaine-Latour was a huge fan of like Schumann, Berlioz, and most notably, Wagner at the height of the Gesamtkunstwerk, like phase and the artwork of the future craze. And these are Wagner's works and words, I mean. And in 1872, Fontaine-Latour actually embarked on the pilgrimage to Bayreuth to witness the inaugural performance of the ring. And what I'd like everyone to notice here in Fontaine's letter to our friend, if you remember Edmond Maitre, is that he describes his sensation of this Rheingold, the Rheingold overture, as being sonorous and veiled. So here we have the conflation, or rather the convergence between sound, as in the sonorous, and veil. This like vague, kind of like optics. In fact, he himself uses the words vague and obscure, as we see in the second part of his letter. And anyway, in Bayreuth, he was transfixed by the sound emanating from the invisible orchestra, and he tried to articulate this, like rather effusively in his letters to Edmond Latour and through his facture or technique, which was, like very, very hazy. And if you look at these excerpts from the press, the focus, surprisingly, was not so much on the opera, not on the story, not on the libretto, but selectively on the instrumental aspects of these operas, which they perceived in Fontaine's operatically inspired works. So again, when we talk about a vocabulary of vagueness, I mean vague diffusiveness, shade, and impressionistic. And eventually we would see a lot of mix and match, like synonyms emerge, such as vaporous, veiled, misty, foggy, and motifs like clouds, shadows, and moonlights. And this perhaps enabled writers to like add greater definition to the elusive spatial and musical qualities that they discerned in Fontaine's works. And just ever so, actually, I can mention it during Whistler. Next, I want to move on to Whistler, who was a friend of Debussy, Fontaine-Latour, Mallarmé, whom we will like discuss later. Um, so James McNeill Whistler invoked musical titles such as nocturne, harmony, and variations to emphasize the purely formal aspects of art in order to de-emphasize the anecdotal, because nothing vexed him more than the tendency to read or have the need to read a painting. So think of all the Victorian soap operas in the form of paintings that were popular at that time. So anyway, this art for art aesthetic was central to his practice, and the best known of his body of work were his nocturnes, which were typically of sea riverside views, veiled in moonlight and mist, that appeared in the forms of his oil paintings, lithographs, and etching. And here we have an excerpt of a letter that he wrote to Frederick Leyland, his friend and dealer, in which he elucidates his rationale for appropriating these musical designations. And also we can see the pleasure he took in irritating his critics, because he writes, I can't thank you enough for the name Nocturne as a title for my Moonlights. You have no idea what an irritation it proves to the critics and the consequent pleasure to me. And then he goes on to describe how it does exactly what he strove to do as a visual artist, and that is to concentrate on artistic interest alone, divesting his work of claptrap. And that's from a different quote. And here I just want to point out, which I've highlighted in yellow, the phrases simply music and pure music, and also the reference to symphony, in this key, concerto, or sonata, because this all links to this discourse around instrumental music, which was sometimes described or called like absolute music by the Romantics, because music, as I pointed out earlier, was like abstract or non-mimetic, and like ineffable. It was deemed to be the most absolute of the arts. So the fact that Whistler only, like specifically, refers to strictly instrumental forms, really like illuminates his knowledge of the philosophical and ideological like debates of the time. The influence of Whistler on Monet. We have one of Monet's rare nighttime scenes, which really parallel some of Whistler's nocturnes, as we can see. So Monet would have been, who had seen Whistler's works and knew Whistler, would have been familiar with Whistler's practice as well as, his rhetoric of vagueness. And we finally, get to Monet. So by the time we reach Monet's works of the 1880s, the vogue for the vague and the crossovers that we see in musical terminology was already well established. This excerpt, in which I've highlighted keywords by like Roger Marks, who was also a theater critic, links impressionist technique or facture and color to orchestration, harmonies, and chords. But the key word here is alone, because it amplifies the idea of the independence of color, which can be appreciated in its as an entity in its own right. There's and one more time, there's a very telling quote here. It's actually a piece of advice that Monet had given to his painter neighbor, Lilla Cabot Perry. He essentially tells her to, hey, forget about what you see, like what is represented, forget about the subject matter, see what you see in terms of form and color only. And interestingly enough, like much later on, like the artist Vasily Kandinsky would remark that Monet, quote, liberated paint and painting from the subject, making them independent. And this, of course, brings to mind the idea of purely instrumental music, the idea of absolute music versus programmatic music. And that is music that is tied to the text, like an aria or an opera, so to speak. Just if you could just take a moment to take a look at the words, the buzzwords or keywords I've highlighted, you will see that these next two like excerpts from the criticism might sound familiar to you because they echo the manner in which brushstrokes in Delacroix's like murals and later paintings optically blend in the eye and how they mutually lend each other reflections. And from a distance, that's when the image crystallizes, and that in turn contributes to the musicality of our sensory impressions. So I've done a close-up view of four paintings, which are about to seek the facture or the technique. Again, what here we have an emphasis on these little dancing strokes, like brush strokes were frequently compared to like musical notes, and when they come together, like chords in music. And but the word that I put an extra emphasis on is symphony. This is the 12th time we've encountered this, and that is because in the 19th century, the symphony was the most ubiquitous pictorial musical analog in the language of reception. The symphony was regarded as the paradigmatic form of absolute music by virtue of its non-programmatic uh, agenda, like so to speak. Symphonies typically have like movements. And in this quote by George Grapp, he introduces a temporal dimension in his interpretation, most notably of Manet's serial works. In other words, his like series. So he writes that they unfold or they come together like different movements in a symphony when seen in sequence or together in a grouping. Here, once again, the critic refers to like different movements unfolding. And if we can visualize music moving horizontally, imagine these works displayed like side by side, capturing, the shifts of light, these atmospheric effects like throughout the day and even seasons. And here we have a direct reference to theme and variations. So this is our next subtopic. The like Monet's like series immediately brings to mind theme and variation, which is the type of form in music in which a single melody is presented and then transformed in different ways. And just as each variation in a musical composition can alter like its rhythm, harmony, or mood, the original theme still remains recognizable. Comparably, the motif in Monet's serial works remain intact but in each one of the subsequent like iterations, we do pick up a different perspective, allowing us to experience both a sense of continuity and, of course, like change over time. Again, these are the poplars. And he actually, Monet, FYI, actually helped put a bid on the lot of poplars, and this lot of poplars was just right outside or near Giverny, and it prevented these from being completely decimated. Earlier, I had just one more time mentioned like purely instrumental forms like quartets, like sonatas, and the symphony. Here we see the use of the term fugue, which is a type of counterpoint. Again, strictly instrumental. So now we go back we re-explore the Debussy Monet connection. Debussy, but before we move on, I do want to point out that Debussy, like musicology, like scholars such as Pauline Ashworth and like Stephen Eccleston, note that it's overly simplistic to equate like musical features with pictorial ones because, the point is that timbre, like harmony and rhythm in music, operate differently from pigment and light. But it's important to note that many of these critics, like writing about musicality in Monet's paintings, wrote about art for a living. And conversely, when you have music critics and theater critics write about the painterly qualities in Debussy's works, it's also overly simplified and terms are often used metaphorically. But in this instance, we have a perfect, example. Like Monet's landscapes are interpreted as symphonies, while Debussy's musical compositions are sonorous patches, in other words, pictures. So the question is just ever so quickly, was Debussy interested in art? And the answer is yes. Like according to numerous like friends and some of his students, he had a lifelong fascination with the visual arts, and he actually, collected like prints and such as engravings. And we know that he frequented the Louvre and the Musée de Luxembourg. He attended the annual salons, attended artsy bookstores, and he also frequented galleries such as the Georges Petit and Durand Ruel, where Whistler's Nocturnes and Monet's water lilies and poplars and just about everything else were exhibited throughout the years. Debussy was also friends with the composer Ernest like Chausson, who was a collector of art, especially paintings by Renoir, Degas, and Gauguin. In fact, he would collaborate with artists such as Maurice Denis, who did the cover for his The Blessed Damsel. And he would ask his publisher to use Hokusai's A Great Wave for okay, so sorry, this is the version in which I forgot to add the print of Hokusai, but I think you have the idea to use for his score, for La Mer, which is one of his symphonic sketches, or in French, esquisse symphonique. So the fact that Debussy would use that term specifically, sketch, symphonic sketch, really underscores his appreciation for the pictorial, for the visual arts. So, question, what were Debussy's thoughts on Impressionism and Monet in general? So, one thing about Debussy, as with many like innovative, artists of the time, is that they did not like to be lumped under a label. He was averse to labels, and paradoxically, like to the umbrella term of impressionism, which he was so often associated with. And he also felt that by aligning himself too much with the impressionists would diminish like his own originality. So here he describes the, like art critics as being imbeciles for their overuse of impressionism. We have a Monet specific quote. However, despite his ambivalence about the term impressionism, he was very honored when a writer compared him to Monet, and he described them both as being students of nature. Was there a link between the two Claudes? Definitely. So if you look at the excerpts from the left, we see, this trio, like a trio of words, Impressionism, Monet, and like Debussy. So there's definitely a perceived connection, a connection there. And when in regards to our like quote to the right, again, it's often a simplistic, linkage. Here, essentially, Debussy has traded his pen, for the brush. But so looking beyond these general, like basic or very general, like comparisons, were there some more concrete parallels? And the answer is yes. So, for example, many of the piano pieces of Debussy's bear these very lyrical, these very evocative titles, such as Reflections in the Water, like veil or voile, which in French bears a multiplicity of meaning because voile could refer to like sails, veils, and also the canvas itself. Other titles include, footsteps, in the snow, or, standing before the moon, or bells like heard through leaves. And Monet himself, by the way, sometimes employed words such as effect or, of course, impression in his own titles to emphasize mood. And he even used words like etude and esquisse and toile, which means study and sketch and canvas interchangeably. Returning to the titles, Debussy for his preludes. So here we have dead leaves to the left, heather in the middle, and brouillard, meaning like mist or fog to the right. He would deliberately put the title at the end of the score in order to allow the listeners like imagination to really fill in the void, to fill in the blanks. And this stems from Baudelaire's pronouncement that the imagination was the queen of the faculties. Um, Next, in terms of commonalities, which we already might have discerned in the titles themselves, is that both Monet and Debussy had an affinity for nature, specifically plein airism, like evoking the outdoors or working outdoors when we're talking about the Impressionist painters. And what's really remarkable about the juxtaposition of these two quotes, one by Debussy to the left and the other by Monet, is that they more or less are variations on the same theme. So if we look to our left, Debussy talks about the magic of, music written as if like written for the open air, the idea of motion, open air flowing and shifting, like filling in the like atmosphere, like open space. And if we look at, I'm just pointing out the keywords, by the way, everyone. And if we look to the example, or rather excerpt by Monet, in very similar language, synonymous language, I would say. He talks about the surrounding air and how that is the most important part about the subject, the changing surrounding air. And here he's specifically referring to the envelope, which you can imagine as like that layer, that space, that atmospheric space between the viewer and the object itself. So clearly, both composer and painting shared a fascination in capturing atmospheric effects and shifting meteorologic, phenomena. And this takes us back once again to the optics or aesthetic of like vagueness. So I just put up this quote. This is Monet, and this is in reference to the envelope. He writes, "The motif, is unimportant to me. It's what I like. What I want to depict is what exists between me and the motif." These quotes just confirm their shared like affinity for the atmospheric. But I want to point out the quote above, because the term impressionism was first applied to Debussy way back in like 1867 about a piece that he submitted to the Villa de Medici in Rome, because in 1884, like he had won the Prix de Rome, and basically the feedback from one of the jurors with regards to his examination piece is that, hey, we're looking at vague, impressionism here, like what you've written, and this is dangerous. And what exactly was dangerous is that it bordered on the sketchy. Okay, and sketchiness, as you know, was a big no-no with regards to, it was like the impressionist painters. It was the most common refrain: too sketchy, this is unfinished and careless. But as you and I know, like Debussy and Monet, their works are not, they may seem immediate and spontaneous and bear improvisatory qualities, but they were carefully, constructed. Monet, we know, retouched a good majority of his plein air paintings, like in the studio. And as one critic like noted about the Impressionists in general, yes, there is the appearance of spontaneity, but quote, it all came from brutal like workmanship. And so this overarching analogies in the Debussy criticism was his translation of visual effects into like sound, achieving, texture like timbre and harmonic color. While for Monet, it was subtle contours and shimmering textural effects and, subtle tonal gradations that were reminiscent of music. Now, following musical selections will highlight some of the generalized technical and formal correspondences discerned between the two Claudes as noted in the press. So I will be playing, I think this is La Mer, which is one of the Esquisses symphoniques that I mentioned, the first movement. And we're seeing in conjunction some scenes of the Normandy and Brittany coast by Monet. And I just want to point out that, a lot of the seascapes that we see, because of the vastness and the crashing waves and the lack of like human like presence, really like recalls the sublime and romantic painting. The next piece that we're going to be listening to is Nuage, which means clouds. And that's one of his nocturnes. That's right. That's a Whistlerian term. And in fact, with regards to this image here, or like the score here, like the nocturnes, specifically clouds, like Debussy wrote to the Belgian violinist Eugène Ias, I can't pronounce his name, Isaïe, that the nocturnes were an experiment, quote, like in finding the different combinations possible inside a single color, as a painter might make a study in gray, end quote. So very Whistlerian. And the last excerpt I just want to quickly take you through is this is Reflet. It's one of his images by Debussy. So again, he used the term images, and this is reflections in the water. And you can do like a quick, oh, actually, you can look at the gestural quality of the score, like the ascending and descending scales and the arpeggios and the overarching lines, legato lines, while we're listening. So some of the parallels that art critics and music critics like saw, but are the short, like fragmented, like motifs that Debussy used. So instead of long, closed, clear like melodies. He would use short like phrases repeated throughout a work. And this creates a sense of atmospheric unity, but also like texture, like akin to the impressionist handling of paint in the forms of dabs or tache, which afar all come together. Oftentimes, looking at impressionist works, there's like, a veiled or hazy quality. And in Debussy's work, sometimes there's a lot of, there's something called harmonic ambiguity, where even the tonal center is there, but it's constantly shifting. So this amplifies, according to some writers, the sense of like coloristic, effects over structure in the same way Impressionists prioritized color over clear-cut contours in order to convey a sense of, fluidity. Other like commonalities is the repetition of figurations, like repeating like notes, like ostinatos, like tremolos, or like trills even, which creates a shimmering, like scintillating effect to both like eye and ear. And we also like hear like overlapping like harmonies in Debussy's music, which creates like layers, which we find in Impressionist painting. And so, in other words, many critics saw these musical compositions as soundscapes that find a counterpoint in Impressionist landscapes. So I want to point out that a lot of these descriptors that I use are very like symbolist in connotation. There was a lot of overlap actually between Impressionism and symbolism. Symbolism, like in a sentence, essentially prioritizes the invisible, like what lies beyond the material world. One, must suggest versus like describe in order to convey the idea. And I mentioned the symbolists because their warm reception, okay, of vagueness, like in art, again, like help set the foundation or appreciation for Monet's paintings and really help to kind of highlight the perceived musicality of his works. But here I just have like a photo of Mallarmé, the famous like symbolist, like writer. He was friends with pretty much like everyone I had mentioned in this presentation up far like so far, these are a list. This is like the glitterati, okay, across painting and literature and music. Like these were guests that were invited to his famous soirees on Tuesdays. So if you were an invitee, you were also called one of the Mardis, which means Tuesday. But back to like Mallarmé, he felt that poetry of his time relied too much on objective referentiality. It was too descriptive and had gone stale. So, in order to restore the magic, the mystery, some mystery in poetry, it must emulate certain qualities of music. And by qualities, I mean music's obscurity and sense of mystery. And just quickly, the painting that I have on the left was actually gifted to Mallarmé. And if you look at the photo, you can see that it's on display next to the mantle to the left. So these beautifully like encapsulate his core beliefs or doctrines. He writes that, poetry needs to become, or rather, language needs to become more like music. For artists, you must paint not the thing, but the effects. And we already talked about effect and the art of suggestion. And lastly, he warns us that to name an object is to suppress three-quarters of its pleasure, or charm. And the specific like images that I have, if you look at the largest like book, that's from his like throw of dice. And so how he applied like music to his own like poetic output was that he experimented with the auditory, sonorous, and semantic and visual properties of language. And this poem, which spans like several double pages, was very revolutionary for its time, especially for not just only for its page format, but its unusual mix of typography. And once again, just to show you this brilliant, really interconnected constellation of figures and who knows who. It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon here. Um, I have a portrait by Monet in the gold frame of Mallarmé, and Monet also did the illustrations for Mallarmé's poem, the Afternoon of a Fawn, which Debussy set to music. And in the upper left-hand corner, there's a portrait of Mallarmé by Whistler. And FYI, it was Monet who introduced Whistler to Mallarmé. I just want to point out how the final, like the final paragraph, and this is from a lecture that Mallarmé delivered in Oxford, in Cambridge and Oxford, translated into English by Whistler. Um, he writes that art, because he's not willing to forsake, the word, as a writer, that ultimately, like poetry needs to, preserve, like, yes, it should be like music. Okay, there should be elements of the obscure and the mysterious. Okay, but on the other hand, you need legibility. Okay, semantics still mattered. So for him, in a nutshell, poetry was essentially dazzling, consisted of dazzling clarity, which I've indicated in blue of the text of meaning, but also the obscurity of music. They were both two sides of the same coin. And if we go to the next slide, this also encapsulates, okay, the work of Delacroix, okay, who described art as a union between la précision et le vague, precision and vagueness. Or Fontaine-Latour, who captured, like air and mist and smoke through his expressive facture. There's Whistler's art for art's sake, aesthetic. As much as he despised anecdotal, you could still read his works ever so faintly. And the same, like, very much applies to the work of Monet. His works only verges towards the almost like abstract. So you're wondering, why are we going back to Fontaine-Latour? And this is because the title of this talk, at least the subtitle, like Seen Through Music, actually comes from a letter that Mallarmé wrote to Fontaine-Latour to thank him for two impressions that the artist had gifted him. How the way he thanks, the words that he uses to thank Fontaine are equally applicable to Monet. He writes, "It is as if everything is seen through music, through a hazy and resonant sense of movement that is present everywhere." And if we look at the works of, Monet, not only are they visually atmospheric, but they are musically like ambient. And if you've ever had the pleasure of visiting the L'Orangerie, in which there are two rooms where these oval shaped rooms are covered in his late water lily paintings, you do really feel a sense of not just immersion, but submersion. And so I just want to tweak this phrase by Mallarmé just a tiny bit. Yes, we look at these Monets and it is as if they are seen through music, but simultaneously, it is as if we are seeing them through, à travers la voile, like through a veil, this diaphanous veil, as well. So there lies the musicality of Monet's works. Thank you, everyone.